When India went into lockdown, many people worried about the effects on its poorest citizens. Ken Lee and his co-authors have investigated that impact on the residents of Delhi. Ken, welcome to Vox Talks.
Hi, Tim. Thank you for having me.
Now, I believe, if I'm right, that you were living in Delhi at the time that lockdown was imposed. How big an impact was this for people who were living there?
Yes, I was living in India during the lockdown, and I remember it being a massive shock. Just to give you a sense of the timeline, back in mid-March, we had just over 100 confirmed cases of the coronavirus in all of India. So around that time, I think that most people were just beginning to understand the true threat of this pandemic. On March 19, the Prime Minister announced the first curfew. It was called the Janata curfew, or the People's Curfew. It was for one day only, completely voluntary, but compliance was quite high. And I remember at the end of the day, there was this sort of surreal moment where, perhaps a sign of things to come, where we all stood out on our balconies with our neighbors, banging pots and pans to show our appreciation for India's frontline public health workers. And then a couple days after that, the Prime Minister announced or ordered a complete national lockdown. And that really came as a shock. Overnight, everything was shut down, including schools, factories, transportation hubs, religious buildings, parks. Everything was closed. And suddenly, there was this great fear, not only about the virus itself, but the potential impact of the lockdown on the low-income populations across India, and in particular in the densely populated settlements and slums in cities like Delhi.
And most of the research into the impact of a lockdown like this really concentrates on the macro effects on the economy. You've gone completely the other way and you've looked at the micro instead. Why did you do that?
Well, I work for the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago in India. We are essentially applied microeconomists working in the fields of energy, environment, and economic development. Now, as you know, Delhi is one of the most polluted cities in the world. And prior to the pandemic, we had been conducting a research study to understand how people were responding to air pollution and the extent to which providing people with information about the health effects of air pollution influenced their willingness to pay for clean air. So long story short, as a result of that project, we had collected all kinds of micro-survey data on behavioral habits like wearing a mask, spending time outdoors, hand washing, all of which are things that were suddenly highly relevant to preventing the spread of COVID. So once the lockdown came into place, we decided to run a few more survey rounds, and this allowed us to estimate the impacts of the lockdown for this population group of mostly poor non-migrant laborers in Delhi, simply by comparing data that we had collected before the pandemic to after the policy came into effect. And importantly, we felt that this survey data could allow us to not only describe the economic costs of the lockdown for these individuals, which we knew would be bad, but also to document the potential benefits, if any, induced by the lockdown. And I'm talking about the life-saving behaviors like wearing a mask, social distancing.
Yes, tell me a little bit about the particular health risks that this group experiences.
Right. So the population group that we study can be characterized as mostly poor non-migrant workers living in Delhi. At the time, we believed, and I think many others felt the same, that the urban poor were especially vulnerable to the health and economic impacts of COVID, as well as any extreme policy measures to combat it, like national lockdowns. There's a couple reasons for this. For example, urban poor tend to live in overcrowded neighborhoods that often have water and sanitation that is not as good as other areas. So these things can cause higher transmission risk. In addition, lower income populations might suffer from greater rates of pre-existing health conditions, or they may lack access to quality health care, which would mean that they would stand less of a chance to recover as rapidly as other people. So those are some of the risks that we were worried about.
And you layer on top of that the particular economic risks of the lockdown for this group as well, I guess.
Absolutely. This is a group where most of the people are in wage-paying occupations that require physical work, often working alongside other people in close contact. And also, these are people who have low levels of savings, which are necessary and which will be important if you, if you need to withstand the economic consequences of a lockdown.
So when you were surveying them, first of all, you used Facebook data, didn't you? What did you use that for?
Well, our paper is really about the economic costs and the behavioral benefits of the lockdown on this population of mostly poor non-migrant workers in Delhi using survey data. But we were also interested in showing, as a sort of first stage effect, the general extent to which the India lockdown shut down all movement in the city. And we didn't have this data necessarily for our sample, but we ended up exploring Facebook data to illustrate this effect. And as you know, if you have location services enabled on your phone, Facebook knows where you're going. They know everywhere that you've been, and that history is kept in their databases. So we were able to access these data. It was anonymous, by the way, and use that data to construct a movement index. And when we plotted that over time, just before and after and during the lockdown, what we saw was this sharp, incredible drop in intracity movement immediately following the first curfew, the Janata curfew on March 19th. And that drop was basically brought movement from to about 30% of normal. And movement stayed that low throughout the lockdown until early May or so, when some of the restrictions were first lifted.
Now, you supplemented this as well with a survey of a subset of the population of Delhi. Who was in that survey?
Right. So again, this was a survey of what we believe is a representative sample of non-migrant, mostly poor men working in Delhi. We should think of these people as long-term residents of Delhi, so not necessarily migrant laborers. But still, it's a sample in which there are relatively low levels of educational attainment. Less than half reported completing secondary school, for instance. They tend to earn relatively low levels of income. So weekly wages are around $40 or $2,000 a year. That falls between the 25th to 50th percentile of the income distribution in Delhi. And in terms of jobs, a substantial share of the people we surveyed tended to be employed in occupations like driving auto rickshaws, street vending, skilled laborers, construction, and domestic workers.
And did you find from the survey that the respondents tended to follow the health instructions given to them, the restrictions placed on them?
Yeah, that was, I think, one of the really exciting patterns that emerged from our data was that there was widespread compliance with the public health directives, and that happened immediately following the implementation of the lockdown. So for instance, mask usage, which, as I mentioned, we've been collecting data on mask usage to study sort of air pollution responses. Mask usage increased by 73 percentage points, all the way up to over 90% of people saying that they had just used a mask. Time spent indoors increased by 50 percentage points, up to 95%. Hand washing, which was already quite high, in any case went up 10 percentage points to nearly 100%. Of course, these are all self-reported data, but I think the larger point is that there appears to have been widespread compliance, widespread adoption of the recommended public health directives, and those should be considered as a potential benefit, if any, of the lockdown.
I mean, that's really good news, Ken, but I guess the other side of that is that really must have affected their potential for earning a living.
Absolutely. In our survey data, again, just comparing before and after the introduction of the lockdown, we saw weekly income and days worked fall by, 70 to 90%, in the first couple months after the lockdown. That was devastating, I think, for many people. The impacts were larger for people who are employed in the daily wage-paying occupations. In addition, there were signs that the lockdown was causing a great deal of mental stress and it was creating negative impacts on just overall well-being. 44% of the people in our sample reported that they'd struggled with their mental and emotional health. So for this population, I mean, I think that's really the story all across the world. But for this group of people, there was very little cushion for them to fall back on when everything was shut down.
Absolutely, they're in a very precarious position during the lockdown. Do we know that the government was able to help them, maybe cushion the blow?
Well, shortly after the announcement of the lockdown, this is in Delhi, the Delhi government reported that it would feed hundreds of thousands of people through a food assistance program. They were going to use hundreds of schools and night shelters across the city as distribution points. And in our data, in our survey data, we found that more than a third of the respondents reported that they had indeed accessed these kinds of services, which is a good thing. And along those lines, we did not document alarming levels of over the course of the lockdown and the things that we were really worried about, like rates of hunger, product scarcity, ability to access medical care, security, things like that. Again, this was a sample of mostly poor non-migrant workers in Delhi. That said, one of the most enduring and tragic memories of the India lockdown is of the hundreds of thousands of migrant laborers who suddenly found themselves jobless or homeless, and as a result, were forced to cram themselves into these buses that were departing Delhi or walk, thousands of miles to get back to their rural places of origin. And so I think that there will always be this question of, was there anything, what else could the government have done to lessen the extreme physical, mental, emotional hardships that so many people faced and perhaps continue to face today?
All over the world at the moment, again, policymakers are worrying about what to do as the impact of COVID-19 goes on. Some people are worrying about a second lockdown. From what you have learned about India, if this lockdown was reimposed on the citizens of Delhi, what gives you hope? What worries you about the impact of that lockdown?
This is a really important question. It's obviously a very difficult question. Should countries like India re-enter lockdowns if necessary? I mean, I think the obvious concern in a place like Delhi is that the economic consequences were already so devastating. It may not even be possible for the government to impose another lockdown. I mean, in our data, there's evidence that people were drawing down on their savings. So it would another lockdown, I think, would impose very difficult cumulative effects for many people. And that said, I do think that there are a couple reasons for hope. First, as is the case across the world, there is more preparation and knowledge now about the coronavirus relative to where we were in March. People understand what the symptoms are, the points at which they might need to seek additional treatment. And in addition to that, and this for me is really the major point of our paper, the India lockdown had this effect where it almost overnight maximized awareness and general acceptance of the critical public health directives that could prevent the spread of the virus. So these are, again, things like the mask usage, social distancing, hand washing. And we need to feel hopeful because Delhi is a large and diverse city, and it is a big deal that we now have these strong social norms in place where people expect one another to wear a mask or to try to socially distance. It's often difficult in a very highly populated city like Delhi, but there are these norms that are in place, and those norms would have been very difficult to form, I think, otherwise. And so these are the behaviors that are that should give us hope, because these are they will ultimately save lives in the months ahead.
Yes, there's clearly a lot that we can hope for, and that's good, but there's some very big decisions ahead. So we'll see what happens. Ken, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. It's been a pleasure. Take care.
The paper we've been talking about is called Job Loss and Behavioural Change, the Unprecedented Effects of the India Lockdown in Delhi. And the authors are Kenneth Lee, Harshil Sahai, Patrick Baylis and Michael Greenstone. It's in COVID Economics 51. Keep in touch with all the new research on COVID-19 in COVID Economics. It is free and open access as ever at CEPR.org.